Hi, this is Daniel. I serve as one of the spokespersons for Nehemiah Reset. Today I want to talk to you about the doctrine of the providence of God. The doctrine of divine providence stands as one of the most profound and comforting truths in Christian theology, yet remains one of the most challenging to fully comprehend. In chapter 16 of his monumental work, Systematic Theology, Wayne Grudem tackles this complex subject with characteristic clarity, biblical fidelity, and pastoral sensitivity. He defines providence as God's ongoing involvement in the creation as he sustains and governs all things toward their intended ends. This doctrine stands in stark contrast to deism, which posits a distant creator who sets the universe in motion and then steps back, allowing it to run on its own without further intervention. Instead, the biblical portrait of God is one who remains intimately involved in every aspect of his creation, from the grand movements of galaxies to the seemingly random events of daily life. The study of providence addresses some of the most fundamental questions of human existence. Does God control everything that happens? How can God be sovereign while human beings retain genuine freedom? Why does God allow evil and suffering? How should Christians respond to the circumstances of their lives? These are not merely academic questions, but deeply personal ones that touch the core of our faith and daily experience. Grudem approaches these questions with the conviction that Scripture provides sufficient answers, even if the full mystery of God's ways extends beyond our finite understanding. This chapter summary will explore Grudem's treatment of providence in detail, examining his definition, the biblical evidence for God's providential control, the relationship between divine sovereignty and human responsibility, the problem of evil, and the practical applications of this doctrine for the Christian life. We will see how Grudem skillfully weaves together theological precision with pastoral wisdom, always pointing toward the comfort and assurance that the doctrine of providence provides for believers. Defining and defending the doctrine of providence. Grudem begins by establishing a clear definition of providence that encompasses three essential elements: God's preservation, his governance, and his cooperation with creation. Preservation refers to God's ongoing maintenance of all things in existence. Without God's sustaining power, the universe would cease to be. The writer of Hebrews affirms this truth, stating that Christ upholds all things by the word of his power, Hebrews 1 verse 3. This means that every atom, every living creature, and every celestial body continues to exist only because God actively maintains them. Colossians 1 verse 17 reinforces this concept. In him all things hold together. The second aspect, governance, involves God's direction of all things toward their intended ends. God is not merely preserving creation, but guiding it according to his perfect purposes. This includes the physical laws that govern the universe, the course of human history, and the individual circumstances of each person's life. The psalmist declares, "The Lord reigns forever. He has established his throne for judgment." Psalm 9 verse 7. And again, "Your throne, O God, endures forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom." Psalm 45 verse 6. These passages affirm God's active rule over all creation. The third element, cooperation, refers to God's working with and through his creation to accomplish his purposes. This is perhaps the most mysterious aspect of providence, as it involves how God interacts with the actions of created beings, especially humans, to bring about his will while allowing them to act according to their own natures and choices. Grudem emphasizes that this cooperation does not imply any limitation on God's sovereignty or any compulsion on created beings, but rather represents the perfect harmony of God's rule with the genuine activity of his creation. Grudem contrasts the biblical view of providence with several alternative philosophical and theological positions. Deism, as mentioned earlier, denies God's ongoing involvement in creation. Pantheism identifies God with creation, eliminating the personal distinction between creator and creature. Process theology views God as changing and developing along with creation, rather than being sovereign over it. Open theism limits God's foreknowledge, suggesting that he doesn't know future free actions definitively. Grudem argues that all these views fall short of the biblical presentation of God's relationship to creation. The biblical evidence for providence is overwhelming, according to Grudem. He surveys both Old and New Testament passages that affirm God's control over all things. In the Old Testament, we find God directing the course of nations, Isaiah 45 verses 1 to 7, determining the boundaries of peoples, Acts 17 verse 26, and even controlling natural phenomena, Psalm 135 verses 6 to 7, Jonah 1 verse 4. The New Testament continues this theme, with Jesus teaching that not even a sparrow falls to the ground apart from God's will, Matthew 10 verse 29, and Paul declaring that in him all things hold together, Colossians 1 verse 17, and that God works all things according to the counsel of his will, Ephesians 1 verse 11. Grudem also addresses the scope of providence, emphasizing that it extends to all events without exception. This includes what we might consider random events, the actions of both believers and unbelievers, and even sinful actions. He argues that the biblical position is that nothing happens apart from God's providential control. This does not mean that God directly causes everything in the same way, but rather that everything ultimately fits within his sovereign plan. The scope of God's providence, all things without exception. Grudem makes a crucial distinction early in this section. While God controls all things, he does not cause all things in the same way. This nuance is essential for understanding the biblical doctrine of providence without falling into fatalism or making God the author of sin. Grudem identifies three categories of events in relation to God's providential control: those he directly causes, those he causes through secondary agents, and those he permits and directs. Events that God directly causes are those where his action is immediate and without intermediaries. Examples include the original creation, Genesis 1, miracles, the plagues in Egypt, the resurrection of Jesus, and certain supernatural interventions in history. These events clearly demonstrate God's power over creation and his ability to work beyond normal natural processes. The second category includes events that God causes through secondary agents. This encompasses most of what happens in the world. God uses natural laws, human choices, angelic beings, and other created things to accomplish his purposes. For example, God used the Babylonians to discipline Judah, Jeremiah 25 verses 8 to 11. He directed Joseph's brothers to sell him into slavery, Genesis 45 verses 5 to 8, and he employed natural processes like weather and agriculture to provide for people, Acts 14 verse 17. In these cases, God's providential control is real, but exercised through the normal functioning of created things. The third category involves events that God permits and directs, but does not directly cause. This category primarily includes sinful actions. God permits these actions because he has chosen to give creatures genuine freedom, but he directs the circumstances and consequences to fit within his sovereign plan. The classic biblical example is Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery. Their action was sinful, yet God used it to save the family of Jacob from famine. Joseph could later say to his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Genesis 50 verse 20. This statement perfectly captures the mystery of how God's providence can incorporate sinful actions without being the author of sin. Grudem emphasizes that God's providence extends to what we often consider random or chance events. Proverbs 16 verse 33 states, "The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord." This suggests that even events that appear to be governed by probability are ultimately under God's control. Jesus reinforces this principle in Matthew 10 verses 29 to 30. "Are not two sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered." These passages teach that there is no such thing as pure chance in a universe governed by God. The scope of providence also includes human history as a whole. God raises up nations and brings them down according to his purposes, Daniel 2 verse 21, Acts 17 verse 26. He determines the times and boundaries of peoples, Deuteronomy 32 verse 8. Even the most powerful human rulers are subject to his authority, Proverbs 21 verse 1, Daniel 4 verse 35. This biblical perspective should give believers confidence that human history is not a random series of events, but is moving toward God's intended conclusion. Grudem also addresses God's providence over the natural world. He cites numerous passages showing God's control over weather, Psalm 135 verses 6 to 7, Jonah 1 verse 4, animals, Psalm 104 verses 21 to 30, Matthew 6 verse 26, and the physical laws that govern creation, Job 38 to 41, Jeremiah 31 verse 35. This control is not arbitrary, but purposeful, directed toward the fulfillment of God's plans and the good of his creation. Perhaps most significantly for the Christian life, God's providence extends to the individual circumstances of believers. Romans 8 verse 28 declares, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." This promise assures believers that even difficult and painful circumstances are under God's sovereign control and will ultimately contribute to their spiritual good and God's glory. The problem of evil, God's providence, and sinful actions. One of the most challenging aspects of the doctrine of providence is understanding how God can be sovereign over all things, including sinful actions, without being the author of sin. Grudem tackles this difficult question head-on, recognizing that it has been a persistent theological problem throughout church history. He approaches it with careful biblical exposition and theological precision, seeking to maintain both God's absolute sovereignty and human responsibility for sin. Grudem begins by establishing a crucial biblical principle. God is not the author of sin and cannot be charged with evil. James 1 verse 13 states unequivocally, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." Similarly, Psalm 5 verse 4 declares, "For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you." The holiness of God's character requires that he cannot be the source or originator of sin. Grudem emphasizes that any doctrine of providence that makes God directly responsible for sinful actions is unbiblical and must be rejected. At the same time, Grudem affirms the biblical teaching that sinful actions occur within God's sovereign plan and are ultimately used to accomplish his purposes. He points to several key biblical passages that demonstrate this truth. The crucifixion of Jesus provides the supreme example. Acts 2 verse 23 states that Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. Yet Peter charges his listeners with responsibility. "You crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men." Acts 4 verses 27 to 28 reinforces this dual reality. The rulers and peoples gathered together to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. These passages show that God sovereignly ordained the most evil act in human history, the crucifixion of his own Son, while the human perpetrators remained fully responsible for their sinful actions. Grudem explains this apparent paradox by distinguishing between God's ordaining will and his permissive will. God's ordaining will refers to what he actively causes and directly brings to pass. His permissive will refers to what he allows to happen, often incorporating the sinful choices of creatures, yet directing the circumstances and consequences to fulfill his greater purposes. This distinction helps maintain both God's absolute sovereignty and human responsibility. To illustrate this principle, Grudem examines several biblical examples beyond the crucifixion. The story of Joseph demonstrates this clearly. Genesis 50 verse 20 records Joseph saying to his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." The brothers' action in selling Joseph into slavery was sinful, and they were responsible for it. Yet God's intention was different and ultimately good, as he used their evil action to preserve the family of Jacob and fulfill his covenant promises. Grudem notes that the text doesn't say God caused the brothers to sin, but rather that he incorporated their sinful choice into his sovereign plan. Another example comes from the book of Job. Satan was allowed to test Job, bringing suffering upon him. Yet Job recognized that both good and evil ultimately come from God's hand, saying, "Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" Job 2, verse 10. The book's conclusion shows that God permitted these trials to accomplish his purpose of demonstrating Job's righteousness and teaching him about God's sovereignty. Throughout, Satan remained responsible for his malicious actions, yet God remained sovereign over the entire situation. Grudem also addresses how God can be sovereign over the sinful actions of unbelievers who are not seeking to do his will. He points to Proverbs 21, verse 1. "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will." This verse teaches that God can direct the decisions of even the most powerful human rulers, who are often acting in selfish and sinful ways, to accomplish his purposes. Similarly, Isaiah 10 verses 5 to 15 describes how God used the wicked Assyrian nation to punish Israel, yet held Assyria accountable for their pride and evil intentions. A crucial aspect of Grudem's treatment of this problem is his explanation that God's foreknowledge does not cause sin. Some have suggested that if God foreknows that someone will sin, then that person must sin, and God becomes the cause of the sin. Grudem rejects this reasoning, arguing that God's foreknowledge is simply his perfect knowledge of what will happen. It doesn't cause events to occur any more than our knowledge of past events causes those events to have happened. God knows what free creatures will choose, but his knowing doesn't determine their choices. Grudem also addresses the question of why God created a world in which sin would occur. While acknowledging that Scripture doesn't give a complete answer to this question, he suggests that God created a world with the possibility of sin because he wanted to create genuine beings capable of real love and relationship. For love to be genuine, it must be freely given, not coerced. This requires the possibility of choosing against love, which is what sin is. God apparently deemed a world with the possibility of sin and genuine love to be better than a world with no sin, but also no genuine love. Throughout this discussion, Grudem maintains that the biblical position preserves both God's absolute sovereignty and human responsibility. He argues that attempts to resolve this tension by limiting either God's sovereignty or human responsibility end up distorting the biblical teaching. Some theological systems, like open theism, limit God's foreknowledge to preserve human freedom. Others, like deterministic forms of Calvinism, tend to minimize human responsibility by making God the cause of all things, including sin. Grudem rejects both extremes as unbiblical. Instead, he affirms what he calls the antinomy of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, an apparent contradiction that our finite minds cannot fully reconcile, but that Scripture clearly teaches. He likens this to other biblical antinomies, such as the Trinity, one God in three persons, and the two natures of Christ, fully divine and fully human. In these cases, we accept both sides of the tension because Scripture teaches both, even if we cannot fully explain how they fit together. Grudem concludes this section by emphasizing the pastoral importance of getting this doctrine right. If we deny God's sovereignty over evil, we lose the comfort that comes from knowing that God is in control even in the darkest circumstances. If we make God the author of sin, we destroy his holy character and undermine the foundation of morality. The biblical balance, though mysterious, preserves both God's holiness and his sovereignty, providing both comfort and moral accountability. This is the end of the first part of the video series on the providence of God. To watch the second video in the series on the providence of God, go to our website at nehemiahreset.org or to our rumble.com or youtube.com channels. Thanks for watching and have a great day. Are you looking for a limitless supply of insightful reads to expand your mind and transform your life? Look no further than Nehemiah Reset's ebook library, where knowledge meets inspiration at nehemiahreset.org/ebook. Go there today to discover a wealth of valuable resources to help you on your personal and professional journey to build a biblical worldview. Learn more about the Bible and how culture is impacting your worldview. Again, that the ebook library is located at nehemiahreset.org/ebook. Hope to see you soon. My name is Mark. I am one of the spokespersons for Nehemiah Reset. The prior video was sponsored by Nehemiah Reset, a 501c3. Our mission is to assist Christians in developing a biblical worldview as it pertains to relevant cultural and biblical issues. We seek to inform Christ's followers, equip them, and mobilize them into action to vote for their biblical values and to actively engage in our culture. We are also committed to help Christians and non-believers to develop a better biblical view. Nehemiah Reset produces videos and ebooks to assist members of the church in developing a biblical worldview when it comes to cultural issues. We produce videos on key topics like public school indoctrination, the woke agenda, sex education, equity and inclusion, climate change, immigration, religious freedom, and much, much more. To learn more about Nehemiah Reset or to watch our latest videos, go to our website at nehemiahreset.org or our rumble.com channel. We produce 2 to 3 videos every week. To get a weekly list of our latest videos, sign up for our weekly newsletter by going to nehemiahreset.org/email and subscribe. You can support our website by liking our videos, subscribing to our channels, or helping us reach more people through tax-exempt donations. Thanks for your help in growing God's kingdom and bringing more people to Christ. Thank you for your support and help. Come back again soon. Have a great day.